All right. This is awesome. Great to see you all. For me, this is a little bit personal because in 2018, I spoke at a conference called Tech SEO Boost, put up by Paul Shapiro and the team. And that set a lot of things in motion for me, for my career and personally. And I'll never forget how Russ Jones, rest in peace, he asked a very, very provocative, respectful and nice question at the end of my talk. And it just set in motion so many new thoughts and concepts. And so there's a lot to learn here. And again, I look back 6 years ago and now I'm here. So this is somewhat personal for me. That being said, welcome to the SEO Ship Show. Not to be confused with the SEO Shit Show that's going on lots of places, but the SEO Ship Show as in getting things shipped. And I want to start with a very quick meditation. I want you all to close your eyes, also the people streaming from YouTube. And I want you to imagine the company that you work for or your client. I want you to imagine that you get all of your recommendations shipped. So everything you suggest, everything you recommend actually gets done. And you learn from that. And you beat your competitors. And you come up with even better recommendations. You're having impact, and eventually you're getting promoted. Now I want you to close your eyes because that's usually not reality. That's not what actually happens. Most of our stuff does not get shipped. Actually, by show of hands, raise your hands if more than half of your recommendations get out the door. All right, I'll just say that's 5 to 10%. Lucky you. I asked the same thing to my Twitter followers, and here the picture is somewhat similar. So actually, less than 50% of recommendations get shipped half of the time. So what that means is for 50% of people, they ship 50% of less of what they actually recommend. That's a lot of wasted work, and that's a big problem. Because if you think about it, the best technical SEO trick or hack does not matter if it doesn't get implemented. It's just vanity, right? So no shipping means no impact. No impact means no purpose. No purpose means no job. It sounds very harsh, but it's true. At the end of the day, we need to get things out of the door. And that's my goal with this presentation, is to help you ship recommendations instead of seeing them die in the backlog. This is also the number one question that I get from the people that I engage with, whether it's at conferences or newsletter subscribers. They all want to understand, okay, how do I get executive buy-in to get my stuff out of the door? Mike mentioned I had the privilege to work for some incredible companies. And I'm not saying that to brag, maybe a little bit to brag because I crave your approval. But the point is, I'm not the most technical person here in the room, by far. There's a lot that I'm jealous of when it comes to Mike, for example. I'm not the best data person here in the room. But one thing that had allowed me to progress in my career is that I get shit done. I get shit out of the door. And it's a skill set that I think is absolutely crucial and complementary to your technical skills. And so that's why today I want to share 3 contrasts with you that I have, so to say, learned over the last 12, 13, 14 years. And the first one is the contrast between story versus database pitching. It is goal versus work, and it is shallow versus deep recommendations. So to jump in, story-based pitching. So everybody wants to be data-driven. We all like to say that we're data-driven about ourselves. However, that's not always how it goes. It reminds me on my time at Shopify. So when I joined Shopify in 2020, and we had a world-class team, we had world-class tooling, and for me it was kind of a dream come true because for the first time ever did I work with data scientists and engineers and lots of smart people, and we're able to project the impact of our recommendations maybe down to the single digit. I was like, wow, it's amazing. We can like really wow everyone with this refined kind of system that helps us understand the impact of our recommendations. And what actually happened was not just crickets when I presented that to leadership, but I actually got a lot of pushback. We got stuck in these conversations about the math and the methodology and how did we actually get to this number and why is it so precise. And once we took a step back and actually not rounded to the single digit, but kept the projections a bit more high level, but tied them to the mission and to the situation of the company, all of a sudden things started flowing and things started moving. So you can be too specific when it comes to data, and the reality is that that's not always what works, because the common assumption here is that executives, they just need to see the right data or the right math formula, and then they'll say yes to whatever you suggest. The reality, though, is that we're much more driven by emotions and stories than we like to acknowledge. As a matter of fact, 95% of all cognition occurs in the subconscious mind. And what that means is that we make most decisions based on feelings, whether we like to admit it or not. So the right story is important. At the same time, there's some data suggesting that almost half of executives rely much more on instinct than facts and figures when running their business, right? Which means that people are biased, and if their bias doesn't match the data you present, it's really hard to convince people. Okay, Kevin, so how do you get this right? I want to give you 3 tips for getting buy-in that is more story-based. And the first one is to actually tie your recommendation to the company situation. A lot of people miss this, right? A lot of people will go out and they start screaming frog or some sort of crawler, jet octopus. They look at the data, right? They see some things that don't look right and they present that upwards. But they completely miss the overall context. And so the context can be, for example, an acceleration. So things are going really well, and you just need to accelerate that trend. And of course, there's the other reverse situation as well, where, oh, this looks great. This is basically time on the x-axis. But there's the other situation as well, where you need to turn things around, right? And that means you need a very different mindset with your recommendations. And so there is a framework called STARS. It's an acronym that describes the 5 different situations that we can find ourselves in, and that we can use to make suggestions, recommendations accordingly. By the way, I'll share the slides. Feel free, take pictures. Just wanted to let you know, if you cannot see this well, you'll get the slides, you get the recordings, etc. So 5 situations. One is startup, right? So you get something new off the ground. Then there's the turnaround, where you need to maybe save the business. There's accelerating growth, which I showed earlier, right? Things are going really well. You just need to keep that momentum going. There's a situation of realignment where things had been going, but maybe are falling off. You need to re-energize the team. And then there's sustaining success, where essentially don't F it up. That's kind of the situation that you're in. But just knowing that allows you to speak to leadership in a very, very different context and maybe prioritize different recommendations, right? If you're in a sustained success situation, for example, maybe you want to try some more daring things, some more long-term projects. Whereas if you're in a turnaround situation, you tell leadership that this might not see ROI within, before a year, that's not going to land very well. Number 2, there are 3 things that leaders really care about, and that is money, market, and exposure. So essentially things like revenue, profit, market share, and risk. And so any recommendation that you give needs to ladder up to one of these 3 things that people care about. But it's not just about the gains here, it's also about the stakes. So a big mistake that I made early on in my career was that I didn't focus on what's at risk here if we don't do these things. I only focused on, hey, what can we get when we do these things? But reality is that people care much more about minimizing risk than maximizing upside. And so the winning formula here is not just your point of view or the recommendation, but also combining that with whatever is at risk if that doesn't happen. Number 3, you want to make it personal. So at Shopify, I learned this what was new to me at the time, thing called back channeling, where essentially you have, before you give a big presentation, you actually meet with the leaders, the decision makers, one-on-one, and maybe you share some of the things you already want to present, you get some of their feedback, so they're not seeing it for the first time when it's in front of a big group, and you can learn about some of their hesitations, maybe some of their counter or pro arguments. You can maybe even persuade them. You can learn about their individual goals. So what are they optimizing for? What is their perspective, right? Especially fruitful when it comes to engineering teams or design teams, which you might need to implement stuff. And number 3 is the wording. So this is very subtle, but if you actually use the wording that from leaders or from decision makers, that can really help you make them feel like they contributed. So I met with people, I listened to how they call certain things, and then I use that exact wording in my presentations, so they saw themselves in that presentation and in that plan. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, starting with the goal. Way too often we get very wrapped up and very excited about technical details, and leaders are usually very overwhelmed by this. So I was like that actually early on in my career. I was proud of the length of my audits. I turned around every div tag. I got super deep, long catalog of things that companies could do, and that served me really well when I was a consultant on the agency side. And then I went in-house and I realized, okay, none of my stuff gets really executed, right? You get like a lot of applause when you present these long catalogs, but then nobody cares afterwards. And only when I started to call out, what are the 3 things that we need to get done right now, toning it down to just 3 things, I actually saw some momentum and traction. So the common assumption here is that executives and decision makers, they want to scrutinize everything. They want to see all the details of your plan. And the reality is that mostly leaders just care about the goal. Are we going to hit our goals, and how are we going to get there? And that's also supported by the data. So 85% of leaders suffer from decision fatigue. 85%, so pretty much everyone. And 72 admit that the sheer volume of data and lack of trust in data makes them so overwhelmed that they rather not make a decision at all. So by actually having these bloated audits, you increase your chance that nothing gets done, or leaders are so overwhelmed that they don't know where to start. So how do you start with the goal? One of my favorite practices is from Amazon, where they start by working backwards. It's also a great book that I can strongly recommend. And a way to work backwards is to start with a press release. So you don't need to actually write a full press release for yourself, but whenever you have a catalog of recommendations, you want to ask yourself, okay, first of all, you want to grab attention, right? Starting a presentation to leadership with a strong punchline always works really well. You need to back it up with data too, right? But grab the attention. Leaders are chronically overwhelmed and understaffed on attention. You want to clearly define the problems that you solve for the customers of the business, right? That's a completely different approach than starting with technical errors in report, right? So start with the customers, start with the North Star of the business. You want to describe the benefits of what you're trying to do to the customers. And then at the end, you want to get into some of the more technical weeds and some of the questions. You also want to speak to how executives think. I had the privilege of having VP and director positions before, and I can confirm that you don't have enough brain capacity and time to think through everything, right? So the common logic, the common structure as an executive is to start with, okay, is this going to help with our goal, or what is the goal of this recommendation? What is the effort needed for us to get there? What are the timings? So can we get this done in a week, in a day, or in a year? And then who is responsible for that? And by structuring your presentations, whether it's a slide deck, whether it's written or whether it's on the verbal track, by structuring them in that logic, you help executives think along what you're actually trying to get to. And then the last one is to ditch the details, right? As I mentioned earlier, people are chronically overwhelmed by too many details, and you actually want to avoid some common red flags in communication. I see this all the time. I'm sitting in a lot of leadership meetings these days, and I see more junior people present their leadership, and they make these mistakes a lot of times. So they first of all, they mention too many details that don't matter at all, right? It's a lot of fluff. They make big claims that are very hard to support. And the problem is when somebody digs in and realizes that the claim, that there's nothing that these claims stand on, that costs you a lot of trust. That can be devastating for a career. Same for clients, by the way. And then they doubt themselves too much, right? They make recommendations or claims that they don't present confidently, and that also erodes trust with leadership. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, You can strengthen your pitches by focusing on revenue, market share, and exposure. You can focus on the wins here, and you can be very clear about the problems and solutions, right? At the end of the day, the best pitch or the best communication with leadership is when at the end of the pitch, leadership just has to say yes or no, right? If you say, hey, this is the problem, here are the 3 options that we're facing, this is why we're picking this option, do you agree, yes or no? That's usually the best way to go about it. And that brings me to number 3. Most of our recommendations are way too shallow. So I had this moment recently at a big client. You're all using their products. You all know the company. And there was an issue where Search Console reported over 50,000 pages where Google chose a different canonical than the user or than the site indicated. And an agency that this company works with, this was their, I have to read this off, this was their the recommendation. Fix incorrect usage of directives and create a plan to improve international indexation. So if you get that as an engineering team, you don't know what to do with that, right? Like that means you now need to go and do discovery yourself, which means understanding what the problem is, why it's a problem, how to potentially fix it, make sure you have the right fix, how to QA it. Like you just waste so much time. You're going to reject this as a good engineering team. You're going to say, "This is we have no idea what to do here, and we don't even know how to solve this." And so the problem was caused by English content in international markets, right? So you go to the blog of this company or to the landing pages, and some of that content was simply in English. So Google mistrusted the self-referencing canonical and just said, no, the canonical should go to the US site. That is kind of the underlying issue here. And so by going to the team and saying, look, we got to fix the way that we display localized content in international markets, you actually help them uncover what to do. And this is an example of shallow versus deep recommendations. So again, the common misconception here is that teams that we work with, engineering, design, content, data, whatever, they just know what we want. They'll figure out what we want if we show them the problem. But the reality is that if we miss clarity, we increase the chance significantly that our work will not get done. So 86% of executives actually identify poor communication as one of the biggest reasons for why projects fail. That's a lot. And I think it's a good push that we can all be a bit clearer in the recommendations and the asks of the teams that we work with, because at the end of the day, SEO is a recommendation discipline, right? Most of the stuff that we do is give recommendations to other teams. Now that might change with AI, but that's a different topic. So how do you do things clear or make things clear? Well, first of all, it's about the root cause of things, right? We often get stuck at the second layer, which is the symptom, right? What do we see as an error report somewhere? What do our tools tell us? Or what looks wrong when we look at it? That often reflects in an outcome, but the root cause is what's really, really important here. So you might not see this well on the slides, but an outcome could be that our ranks or organic traffic dropped. Okay, that's a problem. The symptom could be that there are 404 errors from the pages that lost ranks, but that's not the root cause. The root cause is, why are these 404s occurring? And it could be something like a database crash or some problem with the CMS or some misconfiguration or something else, but that's the layer that we actually need to focus on when we package the work for our partners. Talking about packaging. So there's a couple of things you can do right and wrong when it comes to packaging. A lot of times, again, I see audits where the problem is being described, but there's not enough context for why this actually is a problem. Again, a lot of SEOs assume that teams know what they want, but in many cases, there are multiple ways to solve a problem that SEOs describe. So you want to be specific about the task. You want to split it ideally into subtasks. Most problems are, or for most problems, you need to actually fix several things than just one. You don't want to be vague. You want to be as specific as you can. And don't make the mistake of just, I see this all the time, don't just send spreadsheets to engineering teams and be like, hey, here's a list of all the 404s. Like that's lazy. That's not good. You also want to describe the ideal outcome. And this is also something that I learned painfully in my career. But when you talk to these teams, when you talk to leaders, and they ask you, why is this a problem? Like we often get stuck in these, oh, well, Google said, but here's what we listen to Google, but generally you should not listen to Google. And you get like stuck in these weird loops where you counter-argue yourself. And so 3 questions that I constantly keep top of mind when I give recommendations is, what is the number that I'm trying to move? And it's not always organic traffic or ranks, right? What is the way to measure whether we're successful? Where should that number ideally be? What's the ideal value for that number? And why should it be there? And that's a hard question to answer in lots of cases. But if you get that logic sound, again, people will implement more of the stuff that you suggest. So this could be the number that you're trying to move could be 404 errors in Search Console, right? Now, where should that number be? Should it be 0? Is 0 realistic? Probably not, because stuff keeps coming up. So let's set a threshold of no more than 50. And you could even argue, why 50? Why not 25? Why not 100, right? And so by thinking about these questions, you start to get more clarity for yourself, but you also provide a lot more clarity for the teams you partner with. And now we could, for example, say, hey, engineering team, why don't we have a joint goal of keeping this number at that level together, and then you don't constantly have to chase. You actually get people to co-create with you and collaborate with you. So wrapping all that up, you need a story, right? For most of your stuff, you need a story that typically relates back to customers, target audience, North Star of the business, but spin your story around something that leadership cares about. You want to speak in exec, quote unquote, right? So when you pitch to leaders, to customers, to decision makers, you want to use not just their wording, but also present in a way that they think, not bottoms up. Don't start with the work, don't start with the details. And you want to make it easy for teams that collaborate with you to implement the work instead of having to do discovery themselves. Again, at the end of the day, the best hack or finding is nothing without implementation. But it really goes back to audits. It goes away from audits. And it goes back to things like better stories, pitches, and packaging. And the cool thing is that once you have momentum and shipping, right, you can build on that. If you get things out of the door, you gain more trust, you get more stuff done, you learn faster, and leaders are willing to do more daring projects with you. I share insights like that every week in my newsletter called The Growth Memo. Adam Gant, who is another brilliant tech SEO, called it the best newsletter on SEO growth with insider case studies. And so it's a free weekly newsletter, growth-memo.com. The URL didn't make it to that AI-generated picture, but I'm very proud of all the pirate skulls here. So going back to that meditation at the very beginning, right? Go back to that feeling of being able to ship your stuff and kind of all the impact you can make and the things that you can learn. And so I want to send you off with a question here, which is, if you could build anything, what would you build? And now you hopefully know how to get there. Thank you very much.